Hey everyone, Swing Pony here. Welcome to the Place Your Trades Network, where we discuss trading daily options using the CME Group's event contracts. These give us access to 10 different futures markets, including the E-mini S&P, NASDAQ, Dow, gold, silver, euro, crude oil, and more. I have an awesome show ahead. I have Denise Shull joining me. She is an experienced trader, a performance coach, author of Market Mind Games, and she was even consulted and helped shape the role for Wendy on Billions, which is pretty awesome. So I'm looking forward to talking to her because she is one of the people that really discusses emotions in a way that they can be used as powerful and as a tool. I know a lot of people always say trade like a robot, be emotionless, but we're human. I don't think that's realistic. Like, say it as much as you want. We're still humans. We have desires. We have, wants and needs, and we're complex. So our emotions kick in, but I really love the way Denise talks about how, being in tune with our feelings and why we do the things that we do is a superpower. So great conversation ahead with her. Today's broadcast is brought to you by Tradeovate. They're the ones who've created this custom app that we all use to trade these event contracts. I love these things for days where we have economic events, where the Fed is talking. Any days with big range and trap moves and volatility, I mean, these are really great to trade. So if you're interested in learning more, just go to placeyourtrades.com. We've got a great team that's always streaming and sharing their trade ideas, and we'd love to tell you a little bit more about it. All right, let's go ahead and get Denise Shull on here. Thank you for coming on. You have a very impressive background and experience in trading. You're a performance coach. You're a published author, Market Mind Games. Fantastic book. I highly recommend everyone checks it out. But you also played a role in shaping a very key character in a very popular show. Do you want to share that story?
Where do I start? When I knew that I was playing a role was when Andrew Ross Sorkin called me and asked me if I would do him a favor and meet with this actress. But I didn't know anything about the show at the time. Mm-hmm. So I look it up. I say, of course. Where do I go from there? I, after the fact, found out that he'd actually based the character on me. People don't know this, but she's from Ohio. I'm from Ohio.
Oh.
Her first words in the show are my first words as a coach in my book. Yeah. I didn't know that till later. I literally thought it was. I thought I'd have a glass of wine with her. But what it ended up was like 3 hours in the writer's room. And then I was like, I don't know for sure where this is going. And so I decided to opt out. And Wendy, started talking about my book. And I said, because it's written as a fictional story, and I'm not a fiction writer and it's kind of clunky, and I'm talking to Brian Koppelman, who's a professional storyteller.
Sure.
I'm like, I was kind of embarrassed that it was written as a fictional story. So I said, just so you know, it's written as a fictional story. And his head blew off. What do you mean? How can it be? It's a self-help trading psychology book. How can it be fiction? And I'm like, so, I didn't realize it at the time, but he had been sued for copyright for Rounders. And so that was a flag that he had a copyright risk. Mm-hmm. I didn't know that at the time, but that's, so then our sort of tentative agreement for me to continue to work with him just vanished into thin air. And then I became persona non grata in the New York financial media. And I tried to fight it, but you really can't fight CBS and NBC.
Sure, big boy.
I'm not sure if I knew then what I know now, if I still would have filed a lawsuit. I might have, but in the end, it literally was just like the show.
Just to be clear, guys, we're talking about Wendy from Billions, which is a very iconic role to have modeled after you. I didn't realize the parallels were that similar, like the words she was speaking, where she's from. That's fascinating. But I think it speaks to your career and your journey as a performance coach and how you are such a trusted professional to look up to in that space. So I always think that's a very fascinating story that you have there. And even though it was a little rocky in how it was executed, I think it's a pretty neat story to have.
At first, I didn't want to admit, before I realized everything that was going on when the show first came out, I didn't want to admit that I consulted because I didn't know how much of a dominatrix she was going to turn out to be. And then like that spring of 2016, everywhere I went in New York, people would say, "Oh my God, that's you." And my clients would be like, "Did you work on that?" Like, and I finally just said, "You know what? I'm going to tell the truth."
Yeah, that's pretty funny. You got to be like, yeah, the dominatrix part though. I don't know that's like that's not from my book. Like that's part of the show.
Yeah.
But great story nonetheless. I want to dive into some questions for you. One of the things that I love that you discuss, and it's something that Jared Tendler discusses as well, and I don't hear a lot of other people talk about it. A lot of people go the whole be a robot, you're supposed to be emotionless when you trade, but you very much preach the opposite of that. You think that, being in tune with our emotions, understanding our feelings and why we do the things we do, that's a superpower. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Well, it's basically what the neuroscience has figured out, like originally 25 years or so ago, that a human being cannot make a single decision without emotion. That's not even really debated in neuroscience anymore. But yet, so if you took the emotion out of it, you wouldn't make a single decision, let alone a decision as complicated as a trade.
Sure.
So all of that is just bad advice, misunderstanding that the thing that needs controlled is your actions, is your behavior. I mean, you can feel anything and choose to do something different. Like I just got off the phone with a portfolio manager at a major hedge fund, manages over $2 billion, has had a rough week, is in a horrible mood, feels like he won't be able to make his year back after having a rough, February and March. And yet he could go through his decisions in the last few days and he saved $11 million. Like he's able to feel what he's feeling, which allows him then to focus on what he's supposed to do. Mm-hmm. So, and I told him this morning, I said, you don't realize it, but because you're able to put your feelings into words and understand your discouragement or your frustration or your distress, that you're holding the feeling here and then you're doing the thing you need to do.
And I think that's really interesting that you said that, because it's a little bit of like what you resist persists, right?
Totally.
When we try to avoid the emotions, when we try to pretend they don't exist, when we try to delay feeling bad about something that happened. You had a line in your book that I thought was very interesting. And it talks about, if you've had a terrible trading day, if you've blown up an account, the line is, the smartest move you can make is to let yourself feel disgusted. Let yourself feel bad, embrace it, be okay with it. Because if I understand correctly, what you're saying is when you do that, when you address the emotion, you're actually allowing yourself to sort of resolve it consciously without having it show up maybe in a future trade or in some other form of self-sabotage. Is that correct?
Well, definitely the second part. Like if you don't feel it, you'll just trade it. You'll just act it out. So you'll do sort of more stupid impulsive trades and create a slump, create a spiral, because you're kind of in a way flogging, punishing yourself, but you're also just acting out the feeling of disgust. So you're creating more events to be disgusted about, where if you just like feel it, first of all, you're able to resolve it. But the point in feeling it is to understand, like, okay, what was the mistake I made? What should I have done differently to prevent this from happening? That the unpleasant feeling is supposed to direct your intellectual attention to fixing the problem, like to learning something. So it's actually a gift. Basically, not very many people are courageous enough to feel bad. And what happens when you do decide you're going to let yourself feel bad is you find out it's usually not as bad as you thought it was going to be.
It reminds me of that conversation that's really hard to have with somebody, that thing that you're putting off. All of the tension of avoiding the experience is usually so much heavier than just dealing with it.
Right, exactly.
The other thing I want to talk about that, you've dived into quite a bit. I did a whole timeline therapy situation where I went from every single significant emotional event that I can remember from childhood to adulthood, understanding where the limited beliefs come from, where the emotions come from. And when I tell you there were some aha moments and oh my God, I can't believe I just said that out loud, like revelations and things of that nature. It really opened up my eyes to a lot of how much of what we go through and experience and the behaviors that we possess stem from childhood. So, what I want to ask you is I know a lot of traders go through situations where consciously they're like, I know better, but they keep on finding themselves in the same behaviors and the same ruts and the same patterns. And I want to ask you, like, is that the hidden force at work? Is that the subconscious mind? Like, what role does the subconscious mind play in the actions that we take?
Yeah, well, it's huge. And, with some people, it's close to everything because they're completely unaware that they have these motivations, which are really expectations. And the expectations are repetitions of what they think they experienced. It could be a teenager in sports or, being the oldest or youngest child and not being good enough, or being the baby and not being competent. It's just a million things, which are like fingerprints, by the way. They look really similar, but person to person, they're ever so slightly different depending on that person's experience. But what the brain science says now is that we predict everything based on our past experience. And we particularly predict a future emotion. It's called anticipatory affect. And the world's expert is Brian Newton at Stanford. He's a neuroeconomist, which is really just how does the brain, study, how does the brain perceive risk, really? So we predict how the market's going to treat us, essentially based on our self-image. And one thing I tell people to do is think about how somebody famous that you'd love to meet is going to treat you. So, I'll say Tom Brady, for a lot of guys. For me, one time it was a very, very, very famous musician. How do you think that person's going to treat you? Mm. And then how do you think the market's going to treat you? And they're basically going to be the same.
Interesting.
And it's because your expectation of how Tom Brady is going to treat you is really based on how you perceived people treating you growing up, how you perceived your given role and your level of value or social capital or importance, even in your family.
Sure.
I have a client, he's actually not a client right now, but he's been a client on and off for a lot of years, somewhat famous in the hedge fund world. The average trader wouldn't know him, but for whatever reason, he expects that anybody will treat him well. Mm. His COO said to me one day, he could meet Queen Elizabeth and he would stick his hand out to shake her hand, which is not something you're supposed to do. Sure. And she would shake his hand. And it does totally seem true. And he's lived this charmed sort of life because his expectation is that people are going to treat him like he really matters. And so then he behaves in a certain sort of way so that they do treat him differently. Well, you will impute that kind of thing unconsciously until you decide to get conscious about it into what you think the market's going to do. So here's another example from my life. I basically, at least on superficially, was the good girl. Did my homework, turned it in on time, got places on time, treated people with respect, So when I first started trading, I was religious about my stops. Mm. And then the guy that ran the trading firm called me up one day and said, buy Kmart. And it was $5.50 down from $7.50. And another rule was don't buy it. Don't go long on something that's down.
Right.
And I'm like, what? But basically we went through this whole thing where he ended up buying 25,000 shares of Kmart, which my account didn't support. And he kept saying, I run the firm. But I was I had such a hard time breaking the rules.
Sure.
Even though the owner of the firm was on the phone telling me to break the rules. I couldn't fathom it and then my trading got better when I finally realized, you know what, they're not exactly rules. They're principles and guidelines that should work, but there are going to be moments that
where there's a little bend.
The context is what matters. Mm-hmm. But in any event, you asked me about that. So most of this we're not conscious of. we're not conscious that I just tweeted about a client this morning who, one of the problems we tried to solve, and this has been like a decade ago, was he just always got really big in trades that weren't working. And I mean, really, really, he came out of a hedge fund in London, and I mean, really, really, really huge. Till finally I realized, wait a minute, he's a 6'4", 230-pound rugby player. His MO in life is power through. At the time, he had 2 daughters. They were 2 and 4 years old. And I knew he wrestled with them because he'd sent me pictures. And I'm like, well, obviously you don't power through when you're wrestling with your, 20-pound little girl. I'm like, let's invoke that feeling consciously when you're trading. And that like solved his problem of getting too big.
Interesting.
We made a feeling that wasn't conscious. The power through is the right way. We took another feeling that he was conscious of and substituted it.
Interesting. So would you say that half the time, like, awareness is a big part of the battle? Like just uncovering?
I would say just about all of the time.
Okay.
Awareness is a big part of the battle. There are people that have, the reason I'm not saying all of the time, there are people that have emotional storylines, like the Queen Elizabeth client I was just talking about, where their core unconscious storyline suits the market, but they're few and far between.
Sure. Now, what would you say to people who want to like interrupt these patterns and they don't know where to begin? What are some tips or advice that you can give?
Well, first of all, you got to change your opinion about your feelings and emotions. You got to realize they're at their core an asset. Now, they do fall into 2 categories. They fall into relevant to the trade or the challenge, and irrelevant to the trade or challenge. The irrelevant ones may be relevant to your life, but they're not relevant to the challenge at hand. So you got to, first of all, you just got to believe that they're valid and that they have information for you. And then you have to go about figuring out what that information is. So I used to say, what am I feeling and why? And get those 2 things right. It's a really easy question to say. It's a hard question to answer accurately. When you get the answer right in that scenario, the feeling tends to go away. I think because your brain knows it got the unconscious information to the conscious,
right?
Because the feeling is meant to get your attention. But now I think maybe the easier way is just to say, what feeling am I predicting? Because basically every decision has the expectation of a future emotional state. So like the other day, I was on the phone with a different client, hedge fund, who one thing he wanted to solve was just keeping little money losing positions in his book. They didn't really cost him much, but they were there and he'd waste time thinking about them. It was like unpleasant weather or something, like static, and he tried to solve this problem literally for years and years and years. And so I'm like, okay, well, what happens if you take them off? Well, I lose money. They might come back, which is what everyone says, fear of missing out. If they come back, I'll feel stupid. So that's fear of future regret. We'll feel stupid in front of who? He's like, the broker. The broker will know I lost money on these trades. And I'm like, so the broker will think you're stupid? He's like, yeah. And then he bursts out laughing and he's like, well, that's ridiculous. And literally started closing those positions while we were still on the phone.
I love that. I love that because I think, like you said, it's the holding it in that sort of allows you to ruminate in a way that isn't constructive. But sometimes if you can say it out loud or write it down or something like that, it allows you to take like a more objective approach to like, wait, if somebody told me, that's one of the things that I like to do when I'm going through a situation. I like to think, if a friend came to me with that problem, like what advice would I give? And half the time I would be a lot more objective and straightforward and have a solution to what somebody else is going through. It's just I'm so deep in it that when it's stuck in my own head, I can't figure it out.
Well, we don't realize that we have this expectation about our future emotional state, which is really a fundamental expectation about our future safety, and the brain is trying to keep us safe. So like in that person's case. He knows these brokers. He's been around them for a long time. Now, we ended up talking about, like, those brokers don't care. They just want him to execute trades, right? Because they get paid. But for some reason, he was concerned about their opinion of him, which there's probably another layer in that case where his general expectation if people are going to think he's smart or not. But literally, people do not realize that there's this very clear operating expectation that is dictating their behavior. And when they see it, their intellect is able to say, like, I've had other clients, okay, maybe I am going to lose my hedge fund, lose my millions of dollars, lose my house, lose my wife, lose my kids, but it's probably not going to happen today. So, they realize they're doing this catastrophe thing, which most people do. And that catastrophe thing is keeping them timid, keeping them from getting big in their certain positions. And they don't know it. They've tried to do their plan, trade their plan, have their conviction, do the right thing, whatever, manage their portfolio. But there's over here this fear of catastrophe, which, again, at its core is meant to keep us safe. We're meant to recognize risks so that we avoid them. But what we do is we avoid the recognition of the risk because we're afraid to analyze what we feel. And then we basically act out and create the risk.
It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right?
Yeah.
It's fascinating. Now, I have a question for you because a lot of traders, I've gone through it myself, when you get in a rut, when you're not trading well, you kind of can come from a place of self-criticism and shame, which I think typically isn't the most constructive way to create change. Right? So how do we shift going from a place of self-loathing and really negative feelings and judgment about ourselves to coming from a place of compassion?
Well, first of all, go back to when the slump or spiral or the scenario of sort of one bad trade after another. Just go back to the beginning. Forget everything that happened in between. Because everything that happened in between is a reaction to when it started. It's usually some but I know better thing where, we were up a bunch of money. We took one more trade. We lost it. We doubled down. We didn't listen to our intuition saying, don't do that. We let our desire for whatever we wanted at the time override that little voice. And then we're mad at ourselves. Now we say, okay, put it behind us, blah, 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 blah. We're mad at ourselves. And we don't want to go there because it feels unpleasant and uncomfortable. But when we do and untangle the feelings about the precipitating event, we usually can understand that, and learn something from it. And we realize that everything that happened between then and now is just a reaction to that. One extreme case I had, this has been a long, long, long time ago now, but this guy called me up and said he used to be a fabulous trader, but it had been in a slump for 10 years and had managed, because of his past reputation, to sort of jump from bank to hedge fund to bank to hedge fund, in the course of 10 years. And he's like, I've tried everything. I've done this, I've done that, I've done this, I've done that. So I just, okay, let's go back to when this started. What was the trade? Because there's usually a, but I know better. And what was going on in your personal life? Well, his wife had been kidnapped for her father's money. And when it was all said and done, he blamed himself for not keeping her safe. And he's like, yeah, but I've gone to therapy and I've gone to retreats and we processed this and blah, blah, blah. I'm like, no, you haven't. So you asked me, how do you have self-compassion? What you may not realize I'm saying is all the stuff in the middle is just reactionary. You just have to understand the event that got this spiral going and figure out what you did wrong, which probably had something to do with not actually listening to yourself
Sure.
Like the voice that you knew the right thing to do, you did the other thing. Okay, so you acted out of desire and it made you lose money. Okay, well, you and everybody else. It happened.
Tale as old as time.
Yeah. Now, in the future, you can start to weigh, like, what's the little voice telling me versus what do I want to happen?
Yes.
Because the thing you want to happen is unlikely to be the thing that's going to happen. But the little voice, you have a little voice telling you what the safe route is, usually, if you have any experience at all.
Yes.
So what I'm really saying is, like, these scenarios, both factually and emotionally, are really common. And you just need to understand the first one and how really you probably just didn't listen to yourself and that kicked it off.
Sure. Well, and I want to continue off like one more question based on what you said. You talk about the little voice. I want to know, how can you distinguish the difference between your intuition and impulse?
Yeah. I mean, that's ultimately the question, right? So again, I'm going to say the first step is deciding you want to, like being willing to. And that means being willing to know what you're feeling. And that means being willing to put words to feelings and, like, think of it as a strategy, which generally requires changing your opinion about your emotions because you somehow think you're not supposed to have them, or they're bad, or you're gonna act them out, or whatever. And then you practice. But in practicality, it usually means, like, there's a calm feeling that's intuition that's not urging you to do anything. And that's in contrast to the thing you want. And you have to go, you know what? The calm feeling is usually the right one.
Interesting. So the impulse is the one where you maybe feel your adrenaline rushing a little bit. You want to click some buttons. You want to go into motion. You want to do something.
Yeah, it's generally much more agitated and urgent, and you know. But honestly, being able to compare what you want, you can even put it like this: what do I really, really, really think versus what do I want? Like, it's one place where I use the word think, because you really, really, really think generally the right thing. Like, you kind of know, which is why people all the time say, I know. I saw somebody on Twitter the other day that says, oh, you didn't know, or that voice wasn't right. No, that's actually not true.
I knew.
Yeah, most people know, but they don't. They want something else, so they just drown that out.
Yes. I've definitely gone through experiences where I know that little voice is there, but the part of me where the impulse comes in wants to tone that voice down and just sort of just shut it down. And it doesn't feel good when you're doing it, but the impulsive part of you can be strong enough to convince you to drown that out. But I do think, awareness of when that's starting to kick in, I think, is super important.
Well, it's exciting. The thing you want is exciting. You think this could turn out really well. The other thing, like, in the control your emotions, sometimes they're the have no desire. Make it stop.
That doesn't sound very human.
Right. You've got desire. Like, your best bet is to know what it is, so that then you can decide, how do I get the thing I want?
Fascinating. I love it. It's uncovering emotions. It's uncovering feelings. It's addressing what you think could happen, might happen. All the things that we keep hidden are actually kind of creating the problems. It's fascinating. Denise, this has been a fantastic talk. Thank you so much for coming on. I love what you're discussing, because it really is different than what's out there. I think every time I listen to an interview and I read your book, you're just very refreshing. Before I let you go, let me know what you're doing with the Rethink group. You're, guiding other traders. What is the story behind what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, when I first started talking about this almost 20 years ago now, people started calling asking for help. And so I'm trained in psychoanalysis. I'm not a psychoanalyst, but I started coaching people, and that just really took on a life of its own. So we've got a team. A couple of people are former clients. And then this year, I finally rebuilt an e-learning, self-directed learning course to make this available to more people. It's called Intro to the Trader Brain, and it just takes you through this step by step. so I'm trying to figure out how to do a little bit more of that, put more of this into digital form so people can access it. More people can access it.
Wonderful.
Our time.
Wonderful. And guys, if you're not following Denise, I've got her Twitter handle on the screen, and I'm sure you have the link to the Rethink group on your page, correct?
Yeah. I think I do. I think I have the link to the Rethink group Twitter that has the link to the Rethink group.
We're internet savvy enough to find our way through the chamber of links. Thank you again, Denise, for coming on. I really love talking to you.
Thanks for having me.
All right, guys. I loved talking to Denise and really just learning more and having her answer some of my questions. I do think, the whole aspect of emotion is very, very interesting because I personally grew up a lot not feeling comfortable expressing my emotions. I was always the peacekeeper in the family. I was always, making sure everybody else was okay. And in turn, I was just internalizing everything I was feeling and avoiding it to the point where I thought, I'm just not that much of an emotional human being. So it's been very fascinating with trading because, like I said, everything you've always avoided, all the reasons that you are the way you are, the things you're feeling, they really come to the surface. So it's been a fascinating experience in coming terms with the fact that, hey, I am human. Hey, I do have emotions. But like Denise said, how can we channel this into a superpower? How can we say, okay, I'm feeling like this, and this is why I'm doing the things that I do? What you resist persists. If you're not addressing the emotions, if you're not making peace with them, if you're not learning from them, then, it can perpetuate things like self-sabotage, finding ways to give money back, and really just, damaging the progress that you've made to your trading account. One of the other things that she mentioned that really stood out to me is sort of the difference between impulse and intuition. And that's something I'm going to be very, very mindful of moving forward because now in hindsight, I think I can tell, there is the voice of reason that's calm, that's telling me, this is the right thing to do. This is the right thing not to do. And then there is that, I kind of say like the angel on one shoulder, the devil on the other. Then there is the impulsive side, the one that feels the adrenaline, the one that's just thirsting to click some buttons to make some things happen. And I think, like Denise said, that is sort of the difference between intuition and impulse. Intuition is calm and impulse just makes you want to act. The other way I kind of see those two coming into play is I think intuition serves us a little bit more long-term, and impulse, on the other hand, is sort of short-term gratification. And if there's anything I've learned in all areas of life, it's just that the short-term gratification usually doesn't support us or propel our growth in the long haul. So picked up some great insights today, and I hope you guys did as well. I will see you next week on State of Flow.